Albert LePage Center for History and the Public Interest, and a member of the Villanova History Department faculty. Welcome to the second of 6 explorations of the LePage Center's year-long theme, Cities in Historical Perspective, and a special welcome to our distinguished panelists, Dr. Andrew Demshuk and Dr. Emma Elfversson, who joins us from Sweden, where it is 10:30 in the evening. My Villanova History Department colleague, Dr. Paul Steege, will moderate the discussion on post-war cities in historical perspective. And before we begin, I first want to acknowledge the vision and support of Albert LePage, whose generosity allowed us to establish the LePage Center in 2017. And I want to thank Kevin Fox and Alvin Wong for helping to organize this event. And finally, I want to encourage you to attend the LePage Center's upcoming events at our next Lunch at LePage this coming Tuesday, the 24th at 12 noon in St. Augustine Center 410. Dr. Gray Kidd of Villanova Center for Research and Fellowships will discuss themes from his book manuscript entitled Surrendering to the Streets, Black Artists of Laughter, Anger, and Reverence in Recife, Brazil, 1940 to 1980. And then on Wednesday, November 8th, the LePage Center is collaborating with the English Department and Global Interdisciplinary Studies to consider what speculative fiction can tell us about real-world history. That event, entitled Speculative Fiction in Historical Perspective, begins at 6 p.m. and takes place in Driscoll Auditorium, Driscoll Hall. Please visit the LePage Center website for further information about these events and others, including a planned virtual discussion on Odessa, Ukraine, tentatively scheduled for November 2nd. And now I'd like to introduce Dr. Steege, who will then introduce our panelists. Dr. Steege's research focuses on the history of everyday life and the history of 20th century Berlin. His first book, Black Market, Cold War, Everyday Life in Berlin, 1946 to 1949, was published by Cambridge University Press, and he is currently completing a book on the experience and representation of violence in Berlin from 1916 to 1986. Dr. Steege.
Thank you very much. I am grateful for this opportunity to be part of this conversation, and especially for our two panelists here today. Just one important bit of context to begin. We had initially planned to have 3 participants today. Unfortunately, Professor Rotem Geva was unable to join us from Hebrew University in the aftermath of the October 7th attacks on Israel by Hamas and Israel's launch of a war against Gaza. The constraints on her participation were such that she was forced to withdraw. I'm very sorry that her voice will not be part of the conversation today. But I also think that absence may serve as a useful reminder for all of us of the ways that even the most ordinary practices of academic life and university communities around the world, these very processes that we use to structure our work, writing papers, giving speeches on panels, do not and probably should not remain untouched by the violent actions that occur beyond our walls, ivy-covered or otherwise. So just to note regretfully that we are a bit smaller in our conversation tonight, but hopefully we will be nonetheless quite vigorous and engaged. On a related note, in terms of that topic, for those of you who are on or near the Villanova campus, there is a teach-in on Palestine that will be taking place almost immediately after this conversation wraps up, literally across the tracks in the alumni room of Gary Hall. So again, to think about the ways in which there is this constant spillover between our academic work and the world around us, and that these opportunities to talk about it are incredibly valuable. So let me move on to introduce our two speakers. Each of them will speak for about 15 minutes, and then I will invite them to address anything that came up from each other's presentation, and then we'll open up to a question and answer session that I will moderate. If you would like to, you are certainly welcome in the audience to submit your questions using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Those questions will be moderated, and as they fit into our conversation, we'll try to bring them into the mix and hopefully have a lively back and forth among the panelists, but then also among those of you who are joining us today. So I am very grateful to be joined by two such accomplished scholars, both of whom have found innovative ways to wrestle with difficult questions about how people contest and perhaps sometimes seek to master their experiences of violent pasts. If I were to list all their scholarly accomplishments and numerous publications, we would never get to our conversation this evening, so I will offer only a brief summary of all that they have done and hopefully lay the groundwork for them to introduce some more about their own ideas and their approach to this topic. So our first speaker will be Andrew Demshuk, who is professor of history at American University in Washington, D.C. He researches post-1945 transnational Central European topics that include the forced migration and nostalgic memory culture of German expellees, East Germany's black market economy, the politics of architecture, and urban planning after Nazism, and now currently working on the political, human, and ecological outcomes of brown coal in both East and West Germany. His most recent book is 3 Cities After Hitler, Redemptive Reconstruction Across Cold War Borders, which won the 2023 Alice Davis Hitchcock Award from the Society of Architectural Historians. Our second speaker will be Emma Elfversson, who is Associate Professor of the Department of Political Science at Uppsala University. Her research concerns urban violence and cities after war, ethnic politics, communal conflict, and local conflict resolution processes. She employs both qualitative and quantitative methods with field research focusing on cases in Kenya. Professor Elfversson is principal investigator for 2 ongoing research projects: The Urban Dilemma, which focuses on rapid urbanization in the global South, a project that asks under what circumstances in these cities do violent ethno-communal conflicts arise. The second project she is headlining is the continuation of conflict-related violence in post-war cities, which seeks to advance the theoretical and empirical knowledge on conflict-related violence in post-war cities. And so obviously is a perfect fit for the subject of our conversation today. Like Professor Demshuk, they are both particularly well suited for an effort to wrestle with what cities and what a post-war experience of those cities might look like. So without further ado, I will get out of the way and allow Professor Demshuk to begin his presentation.
Excellent. Well, thank you for that generous introduction, Paul. And in the interest of time, I'll just jump right into it with a PowerPoint presentation that I have prepared. So I've called the talk today Crafting Sacred Sites After Nazism, looking at this immediate post-war portion of my book, 3 Cities After Hitler, so the second chapter. But I'll give you a few of the larger theories as well, because I think that this will help to frame some of our larger discussion about the quandaries of how to reconstruct after the devastation of war. My 3 cities take place in the trifold territories of what had been Germany before World War II. So what became West Germany, East Germany, and then areas that became part of Poland ultimately. Building off of earlier research questions, I now moved into this area of architecture, urban reconstruction, sought to use urban reconstruction as an analytical lens for understanding how we could weld back together these seemingly disparate territories after World War II. So I highlighted 3 cities, Frankfurt, Leipzig, and Wrocław, which used to be German Breslau, because they were all cities of about the same size, all of them with a trading tradition as trading cities along the imperial way, the Via Regia, that passes through the center of Central Europe. And my big question in seeking to find this narrative focused on really 5 discrete elements. First, all 3 cities have a similar physical and material level of destruction, roughly speaking, in terms of wartime bombardment. All of the cities share this prevalence of difficult heritage from not just, of course, from the Nazi period. The Nazis actually built some things, but not a great deal in any of the three cities, but much more also this imperial period beforehand, and the question of what to do with the German heritage in architectural terms after the fall of the Third Reich. And then all three places have this top-down decision-making process in which you have urban planners and officials at the state and local levels making decisions about how to craft a usable architectural narrative after Nazism. And another narrative that comes in then that I talk about later in my work is the bottom-up, often resistance or adoption of this narrative that is created for these difficult spaces. So we have a shared aesthetic and symbolic quandary across Cold War borders, all of them, though, narrated in a different ideological message. This is where I get this term of redemptive reconstruction from. In all three cities, you have what I call a redemptive reconstruction in which your top-down figures are homogenizing the complexities of history through built space as part of a larger modern thrust to create a legible and usable story for built space after Hitler. So this is at the same time construction of a usable past and destruction, further erasure of unusable elements. And I think these three pictures here articulate this in architectural language. In all three cities, the old city hall was about equally damaged by the war. So there was a facade and a bit of internal material left, but a lot of destruction. And in all three cases, whether in West Germany, in East Germany, or in Western Poland, enormous priority was invested at the expense of reconstructing housing or other things that might be seen as more urgent to rebuild the old city halls to serve as a usable centerpiece for each old town. So I'll begin with Frankfurt to talk about the symbolic language of the immediate post-war period. This period in which I discuss sacred sites that became, they were high priority reconstruction targets that were meant to be in many ways individual exceptions to the rule of reconstruction, usually of replication of older buildings, and also to serve as something of a monument to embody what this new place was supposed to be. And in Frankfurt, I could quickly talk about the Church of St. Paul, or Pauluskirche, rebuilt in 1948, exactly 100 years after the Frankfurt Parliament of 1848, the first democratic parliament in German history. So to embody these ideas of democracy as a German tradition. And the Goethe House, the birthplace of the we could say writer and philosopher Goethe, sort of this emblem of humanism, rebuilt on the anniversary of his birthday, and reconstructed, as we will see, as something of a replica of what had been there before. So Frankfurt's Old Town was actually the largest intact old town in all of Germany before World War II, and it was very badly devastated in the midst of Allied bombardments. In fact, only one half-timbered house survived the entire bombardment. You can see it actually over here. And it was survived mainly because the firefighters were spraying a path for civilians to flee to the riverside while the old town burned. And so that one survived. Otherwise, like, this is what's left of the city hall that I showed you in that earlier picture. Most everything consists of burned out shells, if at all. And the Church of St. Paul was no exception. You can see it. Actually, I think it's actually just a little off the picture. So anyway, that's what it looked like. Very badly damaged. And the reconstruction took place immediately after the war with donations that came from across former Germany, including the Soviet zone, what will become the East German Republic. And the decision about how to reconstruct, in this case as a replica on the outside, but a modern interior, that decision was deeply contested, but I argue that the discourse, often fervent discourse about what it should look like, whether a replica or a modern recreation, was just as important as how it appeared. Ultimately, the aesthetic language matters for what it's supposed to convey, but the act of discourse shows the passion with which individuals across various ideological spectrums in post-war Germany, and especially Frankfurt, were debating this place as a potential center to articulate the democratic tradition after Hitler. The Goethe House was, as you can see, damaged in an early bombardment and then really damaged in a later bombardment. That was all that was left of Goethe's birthplace. Here, the ultimate decision on how to reconstruct was determined by the private foundation that owned the building. But after much debate, in which many individuals argued for not to reconstruct the building, that it was a lie against history, that Goethe himself would have wanted a modern structure, or maybe even just a monument in a field of ruins. This was Goethe's house. But this, again, the debate, how do we reconstruct this place to embody a certain German humanism after Hitler, was the most important element. And the final outcome, as you can see here in this image, of sort of a modern anomaly, a replica anomaly in a modern city, conveys in some ways this exceptionalism and also symbolic importance that was tied to this place as an urban anchor for a certain ideological outlook after Hitler. In Leipzig, in former East Germany, Johann Sebastian Bach, who famously conducted the St. Thomas Boys Choir, was also a potential icon for the city's new identity after Hitler of a transcendent musical culture. So again, how do we redeem German history after Hitler? We will frame Bach as a usable cultural path. And there's this now completely forgotten plan that circulated in the same time period, early 1940s, to craft a mausoleum for Johann Sebastian Bach on the site where he was buried under the Church of St. John. You can see here actually the sarcophagus as it would have been set into the floor of an oval structure very reminiscent of Frankfurt's Paulskirche. And I found the Paulskirche mentioned once or twice by architects as something of a parallel inspiration. This is what's left of the Church of St. John, 1945. The tower dated to the death of Bach in 1750 when he was buried here. The rest of it was a neo-Romanesque structure by a famous Leipzig architect named Hugo Licht. You can see the idea in the plans of a certain, now unjustifiably forgotten architect and planner of the immediate post-war period, the Social Democrat Walter Bayer, was to create on the footprint of the former church this oval mausoleum on a main road, the Grimmaische Steinweg, that would go right to Karl Marx Square and the center of the old town. So the sarcophagus at the center of this structure would have literally been a linchpin for urban construction. Here's a close-up again of that earlier image of where the sarcophagus would have been. He created elaborate models and sought to argue them before the International Bach Society and on all levels of the state and local and civic levels. You can see he imagined, Paul, that they would rebuild the university church. It was just a given in Bayer's mind that these old landmarks would be restored, and Bach's mausoleum would function then as a pendant toward the old town. So that literally, rather than so many other sites in the city, Bach's grave would have become, like Goethe's house in Frankfurt, the sight to see as you came into town. And there was a prehistory to this. Rostropovich famously came to Leipzig and visited the ruins of the Johanneskirche looking for Bach's grave, right? Everyone was ready to adopt this as the space. But here again, just like in Frankfurt, the aesthetic outcome is, if anything, just as important as, or even not as important as, the discourse surrounding what to do. It was a passionate discourse pitting concentration camp survivors against individuals who had actually supported the Nazis, to all of them joining hands on each side of this debate on how to aesthetically celebrate Johann Sebastian Bach as the center of the city, and ultimately a faction one which physically moved Bach to be reinterred in the Thomaskirche, where he had conducted the Thomas Boys Choir, in this, I mean, the architect who had actually served the Nazis quite faithfully, Kunstnerade, created this monolithic burial place. The burial place was then changed in the 1960s by historic preservationists who also sort of reinvented the Thomaskirche. And if you go there today, you will see the grave without any mention that it was moved and without any mention that it was under communism that this happened, with an enormous ceremony for the inauguration in 1950 at the 200th anniversary of Bach's death by no less than GDR President Wilhelm Pieck. So there's a long-standing story to be told here about the creation. Of course, the city planning officer was undeterred and continued to try to enshrine Bach's memory, at least, on the Johannes Square with the Johannes Church. He wanted to use the tower then for at least a memorial site. People wrote in with ideas on how they could do this. This person took part in an architectural competition, just a local person. Maybe we could do it with onion domes and a bell tower that would ring out tones that would remind people of Johann Sebastian Bach, or this idea of an archway that would connect the tower with the neighboring Grassi Museum. Ultimately, though, when you remove the symbolic importance from a site, that site can lose its ideological resonance. And in 1963, the surviving tower of the Johannes Church was dynamited by state officials because it had no meaning anymore for any commemorative value, so they saw it after the end of Nazism. So the square is just sort of this forgotten grassy meadow today with gorgeous cherry blossom trees in the spring, but that has no ideological resonance. So unlike the Goethe House or the in Frankfurt or the Thomaskirche in Leipzig itself, this is a site where the ideological resonance was lost. My last examples come from Wrocław then, from a city that suffered not only the destruction of its Jewish population, the second largest Jewish population in former Prussia under the Nazis, but then because of the Potsdam Agreement after World War II, a complete population exchange of about 630,000 Germans who were forced out of the city and ultimately replaced by a Polish population for whom it was a foreign city. How does one create a redemptive aesthetic narrative in a formerly German city? This is not just Nazism then that is a ballast from the past, but also just the German heritage writ large. How does one create a usable narrative? And I found a very similar process taking place despite ethnic cleansing. The biggest difference I found over the course of my study is that your local settler population, without a deeper historical memory of the site where they live, are more receptive to the top-down redemptive narrative that is given to them, because there isn't a civic tradition of alternative sites. Like, for instance, having Bach on Johannes Square, right, where the Johannes Church had been. There isn't any memory of that by people who live there. So the top-down narrative of, Wrocław was an ancient Polish city that suffered an 800-year German occupation seems rather incredible, but nonetheless a narrative that actually still has quite a bit of resonance to this day, was then realized in architectural language. And sometimes this had some very curious prehistory. So this is a model for how to remake the central square in Wrocław into an ancient place. And the Polish authorities used this when they reshaped the square, restoring facades as they imagined them from the early 19th century as an ancient German city. But the creator of the model was a 1930s preservationist named Rudolf Stein, when the city was German Breslau. He had imagined eliminating capitalist modernity from the square and fancifully somehow recreating an ancient German appearance. So it's intriguing how aesthetically the place just can look old, but it's imbued then, in his mind, it would have been with an ideologically German national importance in the case of the Polish architects then who rebuilt the space with an ancient Polish identity. And sometimes it can be quite subtle what was done then to the monuments in the city under the Polish reconstruction. For instance, this is a picture of the city hall before 1945, and I would draw your attention to these obviously Gothic gables, the spiky Gothic gables. When the city hall was reconstructed after World War II, the facade was largely intact, but they destroyed intact Gothic gables to give them this quasi-Renaissance appearance that cite the Sukiennice cloth hall in Krakow. The objective being to architecturally cite a building that's far away that has no relation with the building to say, look, this is an ancient Polish structure. And here you can have a better sense of these gables, which once you've seen the original with these spiky Gothic gables, it's hard not to notice these sort of out of place, arcing, more Renaissance style gable tops that cite a different building. The cathedral was another target. Again, communist authorities were obsessed with rebuilding churches as architectural centerpieces because these religious structures were also architecturally so important to the urban space historically, and thereby could craft a usable national narrative in local space. Here you can see already in 1955, then the cathedral has been largely reconstructed in a Gothic style. Gothic being said here not to be ancient German, as with much neo-Gothic architecture in Breslau in the late 19th and early 20th century, but that Gothic is somehow evocative of the Piast dynasty of the Middle Ages. And here you can see how it looks today with pinnacles that were put on, as the architect himself said, the preservationist architect, fancifully imagining what they might look like as Gothic spires. Another good example is the St. Martin Church, Święta Martini. This was a Renaissance chapel in the Middle Ages attached to a castle that had long since disappeared from the cityscape. A whole narrative was created that this was an ancient Polish structure, that Poles had visited this place and been oppressed by Nazis, all invented, but to create a usable history so that not just Gothic, but also Romanesque, because it was old, was imagined as an ancient Polish style. And I would also articulate, you can see here the obvious brick difference between old and new. The roofline has nothing to do with the way it had looked before the war. Fanciful reconstructed to create an aura of old Polishness. The interior actually a cement slab roof design with a single concrete pillar. An obvious, we could say, almost quasi brutalist entry into a Romanesque design. And then in terms of monuments, Pope John XXIII famously came to Wrocław and declared that it must be an ancient Polish place. That declaration caused the construction of this monument to the Pope next to this chapel that was supposed to testify that the bricks had always spoken Polish despite an 800-year German occupation. Or this crypt of the last Duke of the Piast dynasty who had lived in Wrocław. By the time this Duke had reigned, he spoke German. I mean, there was very little Polish element left in the city at all, Polish speaking. Of course, we're in a pre-national period, but the veneration of this actual empty sarcophagus, there's no one even in it, to commemorate the eternal Polish past, again, with a quasi-brutalist, we could say, finishing of what had been clearly a Gothic chapel. Sometimes you have a grassroots appropriation happening in this early period to the horror of historic preservationists, such as the creation of a painting of Our Lady of Częstochowa by a local artist imposed on top of what had been a Renaissance era painting of St. Michael inside of the the St. Elizabeth Church, now Garrison Church in Wrocław. The university shows us that sometimes a damaged, very badly damaged structure could be restored in a non-Gothic style. This being an obvious Habsburg era neoclassical Baroque structure that is then also appropriated as part of this ancient Polish past. This is a Jugendstil statue of a swordsman. Today, actually, you'll find it on a lot of the stationery of the University of Wrocław, an obvious element from the Prussian period of the city, but the preservationists reinvented it as somehow Polish, and it was adopted. The doors of the great hall of this Habsburg-era lecture hall at the university were changed to put a Polish eagle on in place of the double-headed Habsburg eagle. So you even see in the detailing, the, we could say, deforming of historic symbolism to create a usable past inside of what is ultimately a lovingly restored Baroque lecture hall. The Opera House, last but not least, being a Prussian neoclassical structure, so obviously not in keeping with the Polish, whatever you would imagine as a Polish tradition, but appropriation matters. Appropriation matters so much as soon as the first performances were held here, local people are going into a Prussian opera house and imagining it as Polish. A Polish opera was the first opera performed here, and it's hard to imagine a structure imagined as more Polish in this formerly Prussian German city than the opera house today. Of course, complete with a Polish eagle that was put over the pediment of the structure in the end. So again, I thank you very much for your attention. My last slide being the Max Berg's 1913 Centennial Hall, which was reincorporated as a Polish structure because of this needle that was put in front of it to commemorate apparently the 1,000 years of Wrocław's Polish history with its 800-year German occupation. So I hope this gives us some food for thought on how existing structures or erased structures or the reshaping, reforming, and appropriation of structures can take place in the aftermath of a violent war with much destruction. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew, for this kind of quick tour across these three cities that played such a vital role in imagining these different ways of creating usable paths out of a rather complicated, multi-layered history. And I look forward to digging into that a little bit more. Professor Elfversson, if I can hand things over to you, I'll let you begin the conversation of your take on post-1989, post-war cities.
Thank you so much. Just a second while I share my presentation. All right. So some disclaimers then. As you already know, I'm a political scientist from Uppsala, and I will have a slightly different temporal perspective here, but I think it will still be worthwhile. Together with my colleague Ivan Gusic, I lead a large project on post-war violence in cities, and we're trying to have a sort of a global systematic outlook on this. And the central question in our project, and then of course then we're looking at the time period after 1989. The central question that our project revolves around is kind of why we often see high levels of violence in cities after war, and then also how we can sort of make sense of the way that conflict-related violence plays out differently in different post-war cities. So in the context of an audience of historians, the focus of my presentation will be on a rather recent period, but I hope that it will be interesting nonetheless. And I look forward to discussing how our different insights from our different cases kind of speak to each other. The entry point for this broader project and for the talk now is that it is by now sort of an established fact that the end of war through negotiated agreements, stalemates, or through victory by one side over the other rarely entails an end to violence. And especially after internal wars, civil wars, which have been much more common than interstate wars after the end of the Cold War. In addition, recent research has highlighted that post-war violence often disproportionately affects cities. So how can we understand this? A first general explanation offered in the literature is that cities offer a mobilization advantage due to a combination of urban density, permeability, so kind of the ability to move around in the city, to organize and to meet, given the presence of infrastructure and public space and so on. And also then frequently the presence of group-based grievances in cities. A second important reason is that urban density also means that groups cannot fully avoid each other. So again, especially then in the context of kind of the aftermath of an internal armed conflict, a civil war, people who were on different sides in the war, they have to live as intimate enemies in the city, in the words of Scott Bollens, which increases then the risk of violent encounters. And then these risks are further exacerbated in situations where macro conflicts, which often run through cities, become intertwined with urban micro struggles. So perhaps the most emblematic case is Jerusalem, where the broader political conflict between Israel and Palestine intersects with more localized conflicts over specific sites in the Holy City, as well as quite everyday conflicts around sort of access to different parts of the city. Or take the case of Mitrovica in Kosovo, where conflicts over the right to cross a certain bridge become intertwined with the broader conflict over Kosovo's existence and status. Post-war cities also tend to attract unintegrated former fighters who find opportunities in urban centers, which offer sort of a combination of anonymity and possibilities for making a living. So not least in post-war contexts, cities tend to concentrate economic and commercial opportunities, which may attract criminal networks as well as generate new political conflicts over economic resources. And finally, post-war cities often remain contested. So although the war has ended, there usually remains unresolved conflicts between previously warring antagonists who hold competing visions of what kind of the post-war order should look like. And for that reason, they continue to sort of pursue different post-war orders in the city. So just to clarify what type of cases it is that my research focuses on. A post-war city here is kind of understood as a city that has experienced war, no longer does, but where fully consolidated peace is also not present. So my research focuses on societies affected by state-based war, so wars that involve the state and usually one or more rebel groups. And this is not to deny that other forms of large-scale political violence, including sort of non-state communal violence, may generate similar forms of structural challenges and remaining tensions after the intense violence abates. But for the purpose of this presentation, the focus is on cities that have been affected by civil war and sort of state formation conflicts involving the state. The end of war comes through negotiated agreement or stalemate or victory. And we often tend to pin down the end of war to a certain date, such as when a peace agreement is signed or one side publicly admits defeat. But post-war here connotes both transition and continuation. So it's a state where there's no longer a systematic large-scale use of armed force between organized actors, but at the same time, there's also not fully consolidated peace. So in other words, there's not a widely accepted socio-political order, but instead there are important segments of society that maintain conflicting positions on how the post-war socio-political setup should look. And a return to war is neither unlikely nor written off as an option. And then finally, cities is quite important to define, given that we want to have quite kind of a global comparative approach. We understand cities as geographically bounded socio-political entities that are characterized by a high population density, so a high number of people living closely together with dense infrastructure, heterogeneity in the sense that multiple different groups and interests and activities are present, openness and permeability. So there are these contact points where people can meet, like squares or parks, as well as ways of getting to these spaces through streets and public transport. And finally, then, that cities are units that are kind of politically and economically central in their broader context. So in my project, we collect data on incidents of conflict-related violence in post-war cities, and we focus on physical violence leading to death or serious injury, so kind of quite severe physical violence. Of course, this is a very partial picture of violence, so we do not capture the more everyday forms of violence, structural violence, or threats of violence. Instead, we sort of include forms of violence that are the most visible and that are explicitly political. So that's kind of one caveat, but we still think it's quite important to investigate this type of violence. And so far, we covered 20 different cities across the world. So this graph here kind of gives an overview of the cities that we cover, and then gives kind of the period for which we collect this data, starting from when the war ends, and then in some cases there's war recurrence, which means that it's not post-war. Across these 20 cities, we have coded a bit over 2,500 events of violence that is explicitly related to the preceding war. So the coding procedure sort of more concretely looks at whether events are perpetrated by former warring parties or groups that are explicitly connected to them. whether violence takes place across identity lines that were central in the war, and whether events, kind of the actors involved, make explicit statements connecting the violence to the war. So those kind of are sort of the types of events that we include. And we geocode these violent events with high precision, because one of the things that we are interested in is analyzing the spatial patterns of violence within cities. And these events of violence that we have coded, according to our best estimates, led to nearly 2,000 deaths and over 15,000 injuries across these 20 post-war cities. And some of the things that we find when we look at this data is that levels of violence vary significantly across different cities, which we might expect and kind of in line with existing literature on urban violence, but also it varies a lot over time within cities and across space within cities. And it's kind of this type of variation that we are interested in understanding. So, for instance, zooming in on 4 of the cities that we focus on more in depth within the project, Beirut in Lebanon, Belfast in Northern Ireland, Mitrovica in Kosovo, and Abidjan in Cote d'Ivoire, we see quite varying patterns over time. So the left-hand axis in this graph is the number of events, and the bottom axis is the number of years after the war has ended. And in all of these 4 cases, there was sort of an initial gradual decrease in violence in the immediate post-war years. But after that, violence has spiked at different times, driven by kind of the particular forms of post-war contestation present in the given city. So for instance, in Abidjan, the largest city of Cote d'Ivoire, which is represented here as the red line, we see a spike around 7 years after the war ended. So this is when the first post-war elections were held, and the violence revolved around sort of contested election results. And this can be traced back then to the main dividing line of the war. So the electoral violence here intersected with the way that urban elites from the different political blocs sought to establish territorial control over different neighborhoods and informal settlements in Abidjan, and kind of claim them as their political strongholds. In Belfast, which is represented by the orange line, we can see several spikes in violence. In particular, there is one around 10 years after the end of the war. So this was in 2001, a year that saw repeated riots and clashes between Republicans and loyalists in Belfast, sparked by a dispute over a Catholic school, which was located in a Protestant area of the highly segregated post-war city. So what these examples indicate, I think, is the way that post-war urban violence is often the result of continued political conflicts that become intertwined with struggles over space in the city. And this in turn produces different spatial patterns of violence depending on the context-specific dynamics of contestation. So again, to give some examples, the left-hand map here shows Abidjan, where post-war violence has been quite dispersed throughout the city, although certain neighborhoods have been particularly affected at certain times. And this makes sense in a context where the war was fought over who should control central political power. Although Abidjan is not the political capital, it is the most important urban center of Cote d'Ivoire and the key economic hub. So remaining contestation in Abidjan has largely pitted political opposition and incumbent supporters against each other, especially around elections. And the violence has also included former combatants sort of carving out spaces of influence and control over economic activity in different urban neighborhoods. A slightly different picture is shown in the right-hand map, which illustrates the high concentration of violence in Mitrovica, around one key location, the main bridge over the river Ibar. And here, the war was about state formation, and it resulted in the creation of the contested state of Kosovo, wherein Mitrovica is a divided city with a Serb-dominated north and a Kosovo-Albanian-dominated south. And in this context, then, the main bridge across this river that sort of divides this divided city, this bridge has become a geographic node, but also, and not least, a symbolic site for those seeking to attack or provoke the other side. So The bottom line that these examples illustrate is that different kind of spatial and temporal patterns in post-war cities can at least partly be understood as reflecting different forms of post-war contestation present in these cities. And in turn, such different forms of contestation are shaped by the nature of the preceding war and the way that it ended, and kind of underline the fact that the end of war is not a dichotomous moment that means that society is now at peace. And me and my colleagues have developed a typology of different forms of contestation. We are sort of continuing to explore how it can help us understand these varying dynamics and spatial patterns of violence in post-war cities. So a first distinction is between internal and external contestation. So internal contestation refers to contestation between actors within the city over how the post-war city is to function and who is to decide this. Whereas external contestation refers to sort of contestation over what role the city should play in a wider context within the state or within the broader region. So these dimensions of contestation are not mutually exclusive. The same city can feature both internal and external contestation, as illustrated by cases like Belfast and Beirut, which have featured both internal group-based conflicts over kind of planning and access to urban space and things like that, and at the same time external contestation over the city's sort of broader statutory or geopolitical role. One form of internal contestation is militarized contestation, which is when war has ended, but there has kind of been limited demilitarization, or there's kind of an entrenchment of troops into fixed positions in the cityscape, meaning that going back to war is sort of immediately possible. So examples here would include Goma in eastern DRC following the Second Congolese War, where rebel forces, the government, and peacekeepers all retained kind of a military foothold in this key border city. Pluralized contestation is when the socio-political order is contested by different competing alternatives, which create sort of disconnected spatial realities across the city. In such cases that are often referred to as divided cities, there are sort of parallel political, social, and economic systems, and infrastructure is often completely separate. So kind of having a situation which resembles two different rather than one coherent city. So Mitrovica that I talked about earlier is a clear example of that. Polarized contestation is when the socio-political order is contested by the previously warring antagonists, but within a shared system and a common spatial reality. So in many cases, there are the city is more integrated, but there are these sort of micro struggles between kind of along the dividing lines of the war. Examples include the interwar period in Bujumbura in Burundi, where which kind of Bujumbura is an opposition stronghold in a context where former rebel groups have transformed into political parties. Polarization was high and tensions erupted into large-scale violence, particularly around elections, a bit similar as in Abidjan. Consolidating contestation is when the socio-political order is not seriously contested, primarily because kind of one side has been defeated, but there is nevertheless kind of a presence of measures making sure that opposition is silenced and one-sided domination remains indisputable. So one example would be Sri Lanka, where government defeat of the LTTE in 2009 was followed by state repression and entrenched polarization, but kind of tight security, which meant low levels of kind of overt physical violence in cities like Jaffna and Colombo, but still with a kind of very high threat of state violence. Moving on to kind of externally contested examples. Statutory contestation is when there's external contestation over which political entity the post-war city should belong to. Perhaps the most iconic example again is whether Jerusalem should be the undivided capital of Israel or shared between Israelis or Palestinians in a two-state solution. Dire Dawa is also such a case because its status within the federal system in Ethiopia has been contested in the aftermath of the Somali secessionist struggle. Regional contestation refers to cases where the city is located in a region whose socio-political ordering is contested. So in these cases, there's sort of an underlying larger geographic contestation when it comes to the city status, meaning that changes at regional levels are bound to affect all cities within these regions, no matter how stable their internal socio-political ordering is. So one example here would be Impal in the Manipur region of India, where low-level armed contestation and kind of calls for secession have remained, even though it's not reached kind of the level of renewed war since 2009. And then finally, geopolitical contestation is when the post-war city is contested not only by the previously warring antagonists, but also by regional or global powers that are not interested in the city per se, but rather in its role in wider conflict dynamics. So here, one example is Beirut, which has kind of over the years not only been contested by different groups in Lebanon, but also by Syria, Israel, Iran, and different terrorist groups. So we think that this is kind of a useful way to try to think about how we can compare and understand the different dynamics playing out in different post-war cities. And we're kind of continuing to put this to work in kind of empirical work. I think I will stop there. I want to thank you so much for listening. And if you want to know more about the project and data and so on, you're welcome to check out the project page on Uppsala University's website. I look forward to the continued discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much to both of our speakers. So as I sort of promised, I would kind of give you each kind of first crack at to kind of weigh in. And so maybe we'll give Emma a moment to just kind of catch her breath. And so Andrew, I don't know if you had any kind of reactions, thoughts. I have a kind of some threads that I can certainly throw out, but if any kind of initial question or reactions to her presentation, then I'll give her a similar reaction so that we can kind of begin to hopefully kind of pollinate the just with your initial reactions to each other's work, if that works.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, thank you, Emma, for a fascinating talk, and what an incredible amount of data, and what an incredible amount of cities. It's having done only 3, I'm just amazed. I suppose I will wear my historian's hat and go into a detail that struck me as a question about the greater whole. And that is that on one of your slides, the one about violence and when it took place in a particular city after the conflict, I noticed that the city of Sukhumi is noted as a city that had no violence after the event in question. But it's hard. I mean, I struggle with, how do we define violence? That's my big question, right? How do we define violence? How do we define also destruction, cultural destruction, human destruction, material destruction? And Sukhumi, that example just opened for me a big question, because Sukhumi suffered an enormous forced migration, right? Sukhumi is the capital of Abkhazia, which is a portion of the state of Georgia that has been occupied now by the Russian Federation since the 2008 war. And Georgia is a country that is filled with refugees, many of them from Abkhazia and South Ossetia. And Sukhumi is a city that, if I recall correctly, was about like 116,000, 120,000 people before the war, and was reduced back to its population levels before the Bolshevik Revolution. It lost over half of its population, had like 40, 50,000 people left. And all the Georgians, or those who were identified as Georgians or self-identified, were expelled. So you have a city that is emptied of most of its population, perhaps physically more intact than some other war-torn places, and pacified because it is occupied by a military power that, as I understand it in the news just a couple of weeks ago, is planning to put a big naval base there. Like the continued military footprint, and I would say violence done in a space that is at least perceivably at peace, perceivably not violent, But of course, a place is violent if you remove the population. So I get the Sukhumi case struck me as an example for questioning, how do we qualify violence, right? And how do we talk about, I was thinking of the bridge in Mostar, which is destroyed and then reconstructed, and there's a seeming peace. How do we create places that not only win UNESCO Heritage Awards, but maybe also sustain peace in a case where the populations are still there? Those were just two examples, and got me thinking about people stories.
Emma, do you want to kind of respond initially to that, kind of that question?
Sure. I think it's a great question. I think I really would like to elaborate on as well. So thank you for asking that. So I think it cuts at what we also kind of see as one core sort of foundational aspect of the way that we understand the post-war. So we don't see kind of the post-war as a situation where there's not violence, and the definition of what we see as kind of war and post-war, it sort of follows these accepted ideas about when war ends and starts. And then when it comes to the case of Sukhumi and the kind of 2008 war or intervention, that's something that kind of doesn't change the fact that Sukhumi was post-war for the sort of preceding war. So for us, it's still kind of a post-war period. That doesn't mean that it's not violent. So we're looking for the violence that is there in the post-war period. Then, of course, Sukhumi is a case where we don't actually find a lot of this type of kind of conflict-related violence that we're looking for, in the sense of publicly observable political violence, precisely because it is a kind of one of these situations where you have a cleansing of the population, which means that there is not that much contestation for that reason. You also have this type of consolidating dynamic, right, where this violence is basically being repressed in a sense through other forms of violence. So I think these are really good questions that cut to the core and kind of, how do we see these relationships between different forms of violence, and is there a risk that we signal that a place is peaceful because it doesn't show up with kind of high levels of violence. But these are really good questions. And I mean, Mitrovica as well. I mean, it's my colleague Ivan who is the person who goes there for fieldwork, and he says that, you know, for all of these years that he's been going there, people don't think it's still at peace. People have questioned whether we can consider it to be a post-war city, given that it's so long ago that the war ended. But as kind of events just now in this past year in the news have shown, the conflict is still there. There's not a consolidated peace. Kind of the war is still very much present, and kind of there are these sparks of violence that come up. So that's kind of a broader discussion about that. In the project, the way that we define violence and the way that we define war, that kind of explains how these graphs look, is basically that we look at other data sources that kind of code the start and end of war, and then we look at kind of the subsequent period, and we look for these events of serious physical violence where we have this either kind of it's violence that is carried out by the actors who were fighting each other during the war. It's across the identity lines that are made salient in the war. So a lot of situations like Mitrovica, where you have ethnic tensions, for instance, that would be violence along those lines, is conflict-related violence, or if actors are publicly sort of expressing that the violence is related to the war. So does that answer?
Yeah, no, absolutely. It strikes me that sometimes the worst violence can be that which is not physical, that being forced migration and repression, right? Mm-hmm. And so, I mean, one of the great arguments about ethnic cleansing and even genocide is that it creates peace by separating people who would otherwise fight with each other, right? And yet, I'm always just, I know that's not what you're arguing, and I'm always a bit nervous when I see a line graph and there's no violence, it's just green and there's no red, because of course the violence is beneath the surface. The violence is these displaced people living in poverty on the other side, and this continued assertion of sort of an imperial power next door that could threaten violence at any time. And so that would be really and of course the cultural impoverishment that follows too. I mean, there's So I don't know if the Maidan protests were violent in 2014. I would take that as I like that red on the chart instead of a green where Yanukovych continues to reign with sort of a repressive arm from. So I don't know. How we qualify violence. That's what's really
I think I should clarify that in that graph, the green does not signify that there's not violence. The green only signified kind of the periods that are considered post-war, and it's kind of therefore the periods that we're looking at. So in those green periods, we find a lot of violence kind of along our definitions. And I think these are really good points, and especially I think this point about, oftentimes the absence of violence is because of the very strong threat of violence, or kind of very effective structural violence and so on. The reason that we focus more narrowly on this kind of overt physical violence is that we have this kind of systematic global ambition to be able to cover cases from across the world, and focusing in on this also very real and very impactful other forms of, for instance, psychological violence would be very, very difficult to do with good precision across kind of a global sample of cases. But I really agree with these points. And I think that's the type of nuance that we also need to convey in any kind of in-depth case studies of these types of cases.
If you don't mind, could I tag onto this conversation a little bit, and Emma, give you a moment to catch your breath before I could have asked you to pose a question as well. But I was wondering about this question, and I think maybe this speaks to both of your work, about the marking of the ends of wars in terms of thinking about what that looks like. And so on the one hand, we can say, well, that if we talk about the end of the First World War, there are the Paris peace discussions, or we talk about the Second World War, there's a surrender that's signed in Tokyo Bay, or there's kind of the agreements or the surrender of in either Rim or in Berlin, and we have different settlements, Potsdam Conference, and so on. But I was wondering just about to what extent those markers are definitive. And I know, for example, the historian Mary Demshuk has looked at kind of wartime and about the ways in which even wars like the Second World War, in which one presumes one knows a clear kind of beginning and ending point. I mean, there are complications of that on a global scale, certainly. But even in terms, she's done some interesting work looking at things like campaign medals that are issued even into 1946 and 1947. To what extent do those allow us to think about the ways in which even the definitions of war are ongoing? And maybe, Andrew, for you as well, thinking about this question about war, when people see the war as over or not. And I'm thinking of some of your earlier work about Silesian refugees and the ways, and this speaks now to your question about forced migration and people who have left, to think about the ways in which for them their departure is they're caught in this post-war period. It's not yet peace in some ways because they're hoping to return home. Is peace a return home? And well, to what extent does that kind of recreate something, a different kind of experience somewhere else? And so to think about your case from your newer book of Wrocław, in which there is a new population that are creating a new home, does that mark an end to the war in a different way for them, even though they are forced out of where they had been before? So maybe just in terms of thinking about this experiential side of the end of war, as opposed to, and to think about what that might look like for different people in these different cities that we're talking about.
Absolutely. Mind if I go first and give Emma a break? So actually, that's an excellent question, and one that I think is extremely important to answer at both a macro level and at a micro level, if I may. So at the macro level, actually, one of the best books that I read in my sort of late undergraduate studies that put me into this whole direction in the first place was the back then brand new edited collection by Philip Terr and Anna Celiak called Redrawing Nations. I was actually looking over to my shelf. I'm sure I could use the force to grab the book, but I'll just sit right here and talk to you about it. I mean, it's, to be at the time, I don't know, in my early 20s, in my senior year, and to be captivated by a scholarly edited collection. Isn't that what we all dream about with edited collections? That, but it is one of those very coherent ones. And one of the arguments that Philip Terr makes in the introduction, and that is very clear throughout the book, is that 1945 is an historical marker for historians. Nothing more, because from a macro perspective, the conflagration itself really is continuing on so many levels through to 1938 to 48, really, from Kristallnacht until the end of so many of these forced migrations after the war. And I would make the same argument for the First World War, and did actually when I was teaching about it just today, that really until at least 1922 in so many cases, the wartime conditions are continuing, whether it's the Polish-Soviet War, the Russian Civil War, so many of these Freikorps vigilante conflicts, the Greco-Turkish War, in so many spaces, like actual hot war conditions, to say nothing of private experiences, are continuing. So I think that's something sometimes the peace process that is drawn up after a war can set the stage for even more displacement, suffering, and horror. On the micro level, when the war conditions end, I mean, I think you have to go really to a biographical level in many cases. I think when we talk about these ethnically cleansed sites, whether you're talking about former Lvov, now Lviv, right, which went from being a multi-ethnic Jewish, Polish, Ukrainian, German, Armenian, Greek, multi-ethnic place with a Polish majority, to a Soviet, Russian, Ukrainian city. That transformation really required at least 5 years to really harden more. And in the case of Wrocław, there too, the very process of people moving around so much is still in flux well into the 1950s, right? And the question, is this going to remain a Polish city? Conditions of plunder and devastation in the midst of a city where just the city was bombarded, and the entire water and heating system and electrical system has failed. So everything, all the pipes burst and everything is destroyed in the first winter, right? After all of the wartime destruction, there's a certain element of a war against cholera, right, that is unfolding afterwards. So these conditions in ethnically cleansed cities, also in bombarded cities, for POWs who come back in the early 50s, sometimes that experience of war only ends there. And I think sometimes it's so important when we're interviewing elderly people or when we're reading their memoirs to, on the one hand, contextualize what they're saying, but also to try to understand it based upon how it's going to have a motivating quality in their lives, to be specific. When that person tells you, I was just minding my own business in Breslau until all of a sudden, for some reason, the Soviets arrived in the winter of 1945 and they hated us, and they were brutal and were expelled and everything else, and the Poles arrive, and then I'm experienced war and I try to stay and things are bad, and I'm eventually ejected from my own home, and I show up in the German Democratic Republic in 1947, and then eventually I flee to the West and I live in Hamburg since 1950. That description of war only starting in early 1945 obviously ignores the Nazi period, the Holocaust, total war in the Eastern Front, and plenty of signs that could have existed in one's memory of all of that. But also in terms of one's memory then, and how this can have a motivating power, we note those absences, but also what that means then biographically, and how they discuss war to their children, and how they imagine the experience of reconstruction as well. So that's, sometimes you get these curious stories. In Frankfurt am Main, there was a shopkeeper from Breslau who arrived there as a refugee and built a shop in the ruins of what had been the Zeil shopping area. And he was successful, and he actually had a successful business going until the 1960s, when the urban planners demolished his shop and ejected him to turn it into a wider road for cars. And he described that as another expulsion in terms that were very much reminiscent of war. For him, the war came back at that moment in his perceptions and experiences, and he forged a certain continuity. So So again, there's the biographical level in which we, I think, as historians need to contextualize what are they leaving out, what are they including, but how can this perception of history explain how they engaged with this question of reconstruction?
So, Emma, before I give you a chance to kind of weigh in, I just also want to remind people in the audience, if you would like to post a question to the Q&A, please feel free to do that, and we can try to engage those. Otherwise, there's lots that's going on, so we can kind of continue the conversation for a little bit. So, Emma, I'll hand things back over to you if you want to kind of.
And I see we still have 13 participants, so we know you're there. We want you to chime in.
I think Andrew gave a really good and kind of full and sort of nuanced account of different ways of thinking about this question. I think in any situation, in any kind of termination of war that you would zoom in and look at, you will realize that in some way it is kind of a social construction, the end of war. Even if it is, the most determinate cases are the cases where one side really wins over the other. But even in those cases, it doesn't mean that the conflict is resolved or anything like that. It's just about kind of removing the opponent's ability to continue fighting. And in cases where you have a peace agreement, there's often a lot of things that are still unresolved and so on. So in that sense, but then at the same time, what it does when you say that the war is over, it also means that certain types of struggle or political opposition and so on becomes in a way illegitimate, because it's then, we have a situation of peace where we should be at peace. I think that's also really interesting of thinking about situations where actually kind of the peace is challenged, like in Colombia with the referendum. At the same time, I think that in most cases, the end of war, how fussy, like regardless of how fussy it is, often does mean that you no longer have kind of missiles raining down, or you don't have the same kind of large scale military destruction, and that also means something. I think that kind of changes the dynamics in many ways. I think also what something that in a lot of the situations after the Cold War, like the end of war in one way or the other, has often brought in a lot of international intervention in the form of peacekeeping and peace building missions. I think that's also been a quite specific experience that maybe has sometimes created new conflicts as well. And there's a big literature kind of criticizing the kind of the liberal peace building and so on. I won't go into that, but I think that's also kind of part of that discussion.
Thank you. So Emma, I definitely want to make sure that I give you the chance to pose your question to Andrew. I mean, part of the idea, I think, is that this interdisciplinary framing of engaging each other I think, can be really, really fruitful. And so if you feel so inclined, I would love to hear your thoughts or your queries for him to start here.
Great, thanks. So, I mean, something that I thought it was really interesting the way that you quite vividly kind of evoked how it was handled, this sort of challenge of reconstruction given this kind of fraught history, and so urban reconstruction after war, I guess, is always in some way a very political process, right? So even in these situations, it's maybe you don't have kind of the type of situation with kind of conflicting groups still living closely together in the city. Maybe you do to some extent, but I'm kind of curious to hear more. I think you signaled at the outset that there were, in some cases, some kind of bottom-up resistance to some of these processes. So could you say a little bit more about that? To what extent was there contestation around these big reconstruction projects, and what kind of key similarities and differences do you see across these three cases? I think that would be really interesting to hear more about.
Absolutely. Thank you, Emma. That's a great question, and one I'll try to keep brief in my answer. One of the unifying threads between all three, regardless of the extremely different ideological standpoints, is the contested nature of these sacred sites in all three cities in the immediate post-war period. And I take that to mean, really, again, regardless of the aesthetic outcome, the debate shows the great importance that at least your cultural and political and social elites and engaged citizens place in how we're going to craft this narrative. So there's never a question in Leipzig, for instance, that we are going to do something for Bach And we're not going to talk about how the Thomas choir, Thomas Boys choir was wearing Hitler uniforms and singing for the Fuhrer. That's not part of the story. The story is going to be Bach as this emblem of a usable German past, and the fiery debate, bringing all kinds of odd coalitions together, is really about then how, in a mausoleum or in the Thomaskirche. And the same could be said, for instance, to take the Church of St. Paul in Frankfurt, or the Goethe House, right? These debates go on for months in that case in the popular press, in the wide open, right? And very famous individuals, famous architects, famous thinkers go at it against each other. What would Goethe want, right? Or how do we physically realize an architecture of democracy? The architect Rudolf Schwarz had the ignominy of having built some churches during the Nazi period, and everyone says, you know, from the side, that we want a replica. That looks just like something Speer would want. You're glorifying the naked white walls of this sort of, you know, stripped down neoclassical style. This is a Nazi remaking of the Frankfurt Pauskirche. It's supposed to be democratic, and the opposition says no. Actually, this embrace of Heimat and neo anything, this garish incrustation needs to be stripped away in a modern language that is by nature more transparent and democratic. And what we find again on both sides then is a narrative. We've got to create a building that speaks to democracy. How aesthetically do we do this? The Polish case is intriguing because they're it's the historic preservationists that are often the biggest oppositional figures, trying to save as much of the of a heritage that may not be immediately identified as Polish, right? As inventable as Polish. They'll step in. So, for instance, the argument about that swordsman statue. You have a local preservationist who fights forever that, you know, we have a swordsman tradition in Poland. This is basically a Polish statue. They built it with Poles in mind in that earlier period, right? That you find a narrative, you find an argument in any of the three cities to state that this is a redeemable thing. And what's interesting after that early period is that then other monuments begin to appear around them as something of an island to then further project whatever this imagined past would be. Even in a city that's so identified with modern architecture like Frankfurt, you have the recreation of a very conservative modern style around the Römer complex that could speak in some ways to the conservative modernism of the Stalinist period in the eastern cities. So I'm not saying it's all the same ideologically. On the contrary, they have competing ideological messages, but this debate that rages about how to create a usable past, bringing in people who are engaged citizens from below that we've never heard of, like you saw in those pictures from the architectural competition, really speaks to the fervent desire across so much of society to forge a usable future after the Nazi period.
So we do have a question from the audience for you, Andrew, and maybe I'd propose the following. If we have that question, I'll get you to answer that, and then maybe I have one last question to pose to both of you together to give a chance to answer, and then we maybe tie things together as we approach 6 o'clock here on the East Coast. Maybe we can do things in that way. So Andrew, if you could, so the question is, can you elaborate a little bit more about the concept of a usable past? How to navigate erasure of an important past while also understanding the necessity of limiting harmful symbols of violence.
Yes. And this makes me think of things like, Robert E. Lee statues. And in many ways, this is a very analogous conversation. It was an honor and privilege to actually have a conversation about difficult heritage alongside Ibram Kendi at the African American History Museum here just before the pandemic, in which I was discussing East European monuments alongside the woman who climbed the flagpole and removed the Confederate flag in South Carolina, right? So on the one hand, context does matter. On the other hand, this question of difficult heritage and what we do with these spaces, rather than taking a normative approach, I think I'm going to talk about sort of aesthetic approaches, right? So there is the approach of erasure, right? There is the possibility of erasure of the difficult heritage, which one finds. There's never a debate in Leipzig about whether to keep the bombastic monument on the marketplace to the Franco-Prussian War, in which the Kaiser is there with all the horsemen and all the symbols of German imperial hubris. There is no debate about keeping it. That same urban planner who wants to build a mausoleum to Bach just wipes it out. It's melted down. It's gone. There's no one who's going to defend this thing because it's a difficult heritage and no one wants to talk about it. And obviously, if someone were to discuss rebuilding it today, right, that would be enormously problematic. So that's an example of erasure. There is also the possibility of citation or alteration to sort of flip what this object had perceivably meant or being used for, right? And so, for instance, there was sort of an anti-monument that was erected where that Franco-Prussian War monument had been a few years ago, made out of sugar. And the idea was, it was just a horse too, without a rider. So for a brief moment, that monument was recalled on that site, but as hubris, the sweetness that draws us into war and the ephemeral quality of national hubris, we hope, right? As the thing slowly melted away with every rainstorm, right? That's another possibility, almost in that case, an attempt to problematize but poke fun at the past. And then there is also the possible, one might say, of the dismembered monument or the partial monument. And I would say, to go out on a limb and take an American example, I still think an opportunity may have been lost in Richmond, Virginia, when the pedestal was removed from the Robert E. Lee statue. The statue was removed, and the pedestal became a site of alternate meanings inscripted on it with graffiti, like a palimpsest, onto the pedestal. Anti-racist messages on a pedestal that had held this figure before. And in a way, that sort of anti-monument, whether one calls it beautiful or not, can have its own resonance and its own message in its changed form. So I don't know. Erasure can also, if we're not careful, create a void, and voids are always tempting to then fill with other things that can themselves become contested or problematic. So I'm speaking in broad terms, and as an historian, I always like concrete examples, and that's why I bring in those concrete examples. But that question, eraser, deformation, replication, it's a global question, and I think that the ramifications of how we aesthetically reconstruct and how the debate forms around that reconstruction is of the utmost importance, and one to be taken very carefully.
Thank you. So as we approach kind of the end here, I thought maybe I would pick up on some similar language from your two presentations and maybe ask you just briefly to comment on that. And so, Andrew, you talked about sacred sites. Emma, you talked about symbolic sites, and both of you have talked about the ways in which they are to varying degrees contested in these post-war cities. And I wonder if maybe we can talk about it. Andrew, you mentioned about the ways in which, well, kind of violence is either present or not present, or visible or invisible in these moments. And Emma, you talked about the ways in which some of these symbolic sites become explicitly battled over and sites for encounters of violence. And maybe we can talk about that even in this space between war and peace, this post-war experience. What is it that makes these sites explosive? What is it that makes them maybe in some cases even literally explosive? To what extent they become points for violence for some people or not? Or maybe this becomes another way of talking about agency in this. So who decides to act violence? Or maybe if we're thinking about the local, and this is picking up on something of Emma's work that we haven't really talked about, but who become mediators or peacemakers in this moment? What leads them to do that in these contested or symbolic locations in particular? So maybe if each of you just have kind of one example that kind of speaks specifically to this ways in which these contested symbolic sites can result in violence or produce violence, or perhaps produce something that tends towards peace and not towards violence. Maybe Emma, you can go first.
And then, you want me to go first?
Or whoever wants to go first.
Emma, why don't you go first? You do it.
Okay, sure, I will. So you want us to answer this in about 2 minutes each?
Of course, it's just to tie it everything to a nice bow. Yeah.
I guess I'll try to cherry pick a little bit. And I think the example that I used was this main bridge in Mitrovica. And I think what I would say to that broader question of what makes specific sites very explosive, I think it can often be something quite mundane. I mean, sometimes it's kind of symbolic sites in the sense that, there was a war over central government, and then kind of, the parliament building becomes a symbolic site. But oftentimes it can be sites that don't have, an obvious symbolic importance, right? In the case of Mitrovica, the main bridge is it's clearly a geographical node between the two sides. So for that reason, it kind of makes sense that becomes such a symbolic site and such an explosive site. But it's also then kind of the kind of aggregating lived experience of violence in that site, and the fact that peacekeepers are positioned on that bridge to keep the sites apart, and kind of the fact that like opening or closing the bridge to allow traffic across becomes kind of a symbol of, like what direction are we moving in. And that, I mean, I think that's also kind of to get at that other question, maybe not so much about mediators, but kind of, I mean, these symbolic sites can also have, the other type of role, like, right? They can be sites where we can make peaceful gestures and kind of take steps towards peace as well. So, and the exact conditions under that can happen. I think maybe there's little time to talk about, but I think that's important to keep in mind as well, that kind of the sites that become key kind of violent sites can also be crucial sites for movements or processes that move in a kind of away from confrontation and away from contestation and towards coexistence in whatever form.
Yeah, I think I'll also take on a happy ending for our talk today and talk about peace. And I'm going to talk about one of the buildings that I mentioned, the construction of the cathedral in Wrocław. And it was intriguing in 2005 when I was in Wrocław for the first time. There's an elevator. That's a nice thing about a modern building with an old style. You can take an elevator instead of a staircase. Went up the elevator to the top of the tower, was looking out in the city of Wrocław, and encountered a German fellow who'd been going back to Wrocław, he said, since 1972 to visit his old Heimat, his old home. And I said, well, why do you come up to the cathedral then? Surely for the view. And he said, this is where I had a wonderful conversation with Polish inhabitants of Wrocław for the first time. And I realized what this city now means to them as their home. And I talked about what it had meant to me. And it was there actually in that conversation and realizing this is not some revanchist, this is not someone who wanted the space back. He was using this space that was built as an ancient Piast site as a place to meet other people here who lived there now. These sites are reconstructed by people who at this point are largely dead. They have bequeathed them to us and we can make of them what we will. And in this case, these human beings chose to take this site and make it as a place of meetings and to get to know each other on a human level rather than how their governments had tried to frame them, often as eternal adversaries, right? With all kinds of historical lies about whose this was and when and where. And so I think that should give us hope that on a human level, it's possible to have these conversations. But unfortunately, fresh waves of violence or frozen conflicts that don't allow for these kinds of conversations can lead to further violence and destruction in the future.
Thank you very much. Maybe on that note is a good reminder that as much as we think about war and post-war as these grand events, that even these big events are comprised of small relationships. And within those small relationships, there are possibilities for remakings of these places and these experiences that while they may start small, that they have the possibility to have larger impacts. I am very grateful to both of you for joining us today and for sharing your insights and your expertise. I feel greatly privileged to have learned from you today on behalf of the LePage Center and Villanova. It is wonderful to have this day of experience about about a difficult subject, but also to end a little bit on a hopeful note. For all the participants who are still here and the audience members, I encourage you to take a look at the chat to look at the upcoming events for the LePage Center. Otherwise, thank you for joining us. Have a pleasant afternoon or evening. And look forward to seeing you either online or in person at some point, hopefully before too long. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you.